Imagine a ballistic missile is fired at a civilian commercial ship.
Right.
And in the time it takes you to watch, like a single sitcom episode, roughly 20 minutes, the United States military has completely responded.
Yeah.
I mean, they detected the launch, identified where it came from, authorized a massive lethal response, and literally already dropped high explosives on the target in southern Iran.
It's incredibly fast.
Right. So today we are looking at this hyper-compressed 24-hour window where basically the sheer speed of modern warfare just entirely shattered a very fragile geopolitical peace.
Yeah, because we are dissecting a scenario where the traditional chess match of international diplomacy has just been violently swept off the table.
Exactly.
We are no longer dealing with formal declarations or, back-channel negotiations. We are operating in this environment where both sides are essentially using live ammunition to communicate.
Which is terrifying. So, welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to make sense of a really chaotic and rapidly evolving military crisis in the Middle East.
And there's a lot to cover.
So much. The sources we're working from today for you guys are dense, they're immediate, primarily consisting of real-time intelligence analysis and transcripts from a breaking news broadcast.
Right. Featuring the former intelligence analyst Stefano Retandale and geopolitical commentator Mario Nawfal.
Yeah. So we're going to map out the exact timeline of this massive exchange of fire between the U.S., its Gulf allies, and Iran.
We also need to decode the unprecedented geographic shift in the targets being hit.
Yes, the targets are wild, and we're going to uncover the internal fractured politics in both Washington and Tehran that are, frankly, pouring gasoline on this fire.
The real value of this specific intelligence analysis is that it strips away the political rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
It looks strictly at the mechanics of the conflict. It shows us this fundamental breakdown of a standing memorandum of understanding an MOU. And it really signals a shift to a reality where the rules of engagement are being rewritten, like, by the hour.
Okay, let's unpack this. But before we get into the actual kinetic strikes, just a quick but critical note for you, the listener.
Important to state this.
Very important. The intelligence and broadcast transcripts we are examining today contain highly sensitive political information.
Yeah, involving the current administrations and internal power struggles of multiple nations.
Right. So we are going to neutrally report the events, the military strategies, and the domestic political dynamics exactly as they are presented in this source material.
We are not endorsing any viewpoint.
Nope. We're not taking sides, and we are not advocating for any political figure. Our sole objective is to give you a clear, objective understanding of the mechanics driving this crisis based on the provided analysis.
Because, honestly, the most dangerous thing you can do in a volatile geopolitical situation like this is view it through a partisan lens.
Totally agree.
Understanding the why behind these military actions really requires looking at the raw, unvarnished data.
So let's look at how the powder keg actually ignited, because the most staggering part of this intelligence timeline is just the sheer compression of events.
It happened so fast.
Right. The catalyst, according to the broadcast transcripts, was a specific ultimatum. Former President Trump demanded that Iran formally apologize and publicly announce that the Strait of Hormuz was open and safe for global maritime passage.
Which, that is a demand that strikes at the absolute core of Iranian strategic leverage.
How so?
Well, the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a waterway, right?
Yeah.
It is the central artery of global energy markets.
Right. It's huge.
A third of the world's liquefied natural gas and almost a quarter of total global oil consumption passes through that one narrow choke point.
Wow.
So demanding Iran publicly relinquishing control over it is, well, it's basically asking them to voluntarily disarm their most potent economic weapon.
And exactly 24 hours after that demand, Iran delivered its answer. But they didn't issue a press release.
No, they did not.
No. They announced the strait was closed, and they fired a weapon at a civilian ship crossing through the Omani side of the strait. And the intelligence analysts place a massive emphasis on a specific technical distinction here, which is that this was a ballistic missile.
Right, and that distinction changes the entire threat matrix.
Like, how different is it from what they usually do?
Well, for years, we've seen localized harassment in these waters using, like, loitering munitions or small drones.
Right, the drone swarms.
Exactly. And a drone attack on a massive commercial hull can often be brushed off diplomatically as harassment, or maybe a warning shot.
Because they don't usually sink the ship.
Right. They cause damage, but they rarely sink a vessel. A ballistic missile, however, brings an entirely different kinetic reality.
Right.
It travels at immense speed with a payload designed to obliterate structural integrity.
Yeah, that's not a warning.
No, firing a missile at a civilian ship is not a warning. It is an attempt to destroy the vessel and kill the crew.
Fortunately, the sources note the personnel on that specific ship did manage to evacuate safely.
Thankfully.
Yeah. But the vessel itself took severe damage. But, the Iranian strike is only the first half of this equation. The U.S. retaliation is where the timeline becomes almost incomprehensible to a civilian observer.
Really is.
The reports emphasize that within 20 minutes, just 20 minutes after that Iranian missile launch, the U.S. began its retaliation.
Striking multiple locations in southern Iran.
Yeah. And a 20-minute response time is just baffling to me. I mean, you can barely get a pizza delivered in 20 minutes, let alone mobilize an international airstrike.
Exactly.
To me, that screams that U.S. Central Command, or CACOM, wasn't reacting. They were waiting. Like, they must have had the target coordinates plugged into the jets before the Iranian missile even left the tube.
Your intuition is spot on there. A 20-minute turnaround from an enemy launch to bangs on target completely bypasses the traditional military decision-making process.
It has to, right?
You cannot observe an attack, route the intelligence to the Pentagon, convene a meeting of military leadership, brief the president, get authorization, transmit that authorization back to the theater, scramble jets, and drop ordnance in 20 minutes.
It's physically impossible.
The physics of military bureaucracy simply do not allow for it.
So how did they do it?
It implies two massive realities about CENTCOM's posture leading up to that moment. First, they had incredibly high-fidelity prior intelligence.
Like intercepts.
Yeah, they were likely sitting on intercepts or persistent surveillance that told them the Iranians were moving the missile batteries into firing position.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, and more importantly, it means they were operating on pre-approved force packages.
Pre-approved. Okay.
The sources indicate that the administration, specifically noting the involvement of Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and CENTCOM Commander Brad Cooper, had already authorized a menu of immediate retaliatory strikes.
So they basically had a playbook ready to go.
Exactly. The directive was effectively, the moment you confirm an Iranian launch against a vessel, you have the green light to execute Strike Package Alpha. The authority was delegated down to the tactical level.
The sources bring up a really great framework for understanding this, distinguishing between dynamic and deliberate strikes.
Right, dynamic versus deliberate.
Yeah, and if I'm interpreting this right, a deliberate strike is like a meticulously planned heist. You spend weeks building intelligence, assessing collateral damage, and targeting complex, buried infrastructure.
Like a command and control bunker or a drone manufacturing plant.
Right. It takes time. But a dynamic strike is a pure reflex. You're flying a drone, you spot a mobile radar system flip on, and you hit it before they can pack it up and move.
That is the exact doctrinal difference. And the key enabler for those dynamic strikes is unbroken surveillance.
Right. Always having eyes on.
The intelligence analysis notes that the U.S. never ceased its intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR, flights over Iranian territory, even during the supposed diplomatic pauses.
So they were always watching.
They maintained a continuous real-time map of the battle space.
There's a fascinating technological detail the sources outline regarding how this actually works in practice, too.
Yeah, the data link.
Right. They describe a system where the second an Iranian crew pulls a mobile missile launcher out of camouflage, a U.S. satellite detects the heat signature or movement.
Instantly.
And then the satellite beams those exact GPS coordinates directly into the targeting computer of a U.S. fighter jet that is already loitering in the air nearby.
So the pilot just has to confirm and fire.
Exactly. It completely collapses what the military calls the kill chain.
It really does. Historically, a sensor finds a target, sends the data to a command center, analysts verify it, commanders authorize the strike, and then they assign a shooter.
And by the time the shooter arrives...
the target has moved.
Right.
But by directly networking the satellite to the cockpit, the time from identification to destruction is reduced to mere minutes. That is literally the only way a 20-minute retaliation is physically possible.
So CENTCOM is acting with this unprecedented, almost automated speed. But, the most jarring detail in these intelligence reports isn't when the U.S. fired, it's where they fired from.
Yes, the geography.
We are seeing Gulf nations stepping out of the shadows in a way that fundamentally alters the regional map.
It is a diplomatic earthquake.
Yeah.
For decades, the U.S. has maintained a massive footprint in the Gulf. But the host nations have largely preferred to keep those operations quiet.
Maintaining that veneer of neutrality.
Exactly, to avoid provoking Tehran directly.
Well, that veneer is gone because the sources report that land-to-land missiles were fired into Iran directly from the sovereign territories of Kuwait and Bahrain.
Which is massive.
They speculate these are systems like Atacap-ES or HIMARS. Now, these aren't just, mortars you lob over a fence. They are highly advanced supersonic ballistic missiles that can hit a pinpoint target up to 300 kilometers away.
Yeah, they are serious weapons.
So allowing these to be fired from your soil isn't a passive act of hosting a base. It's a massive, highly visible, kinetic escalation.
And the sources emphasize a critical legal and diplomatic reality here. The U.S. cannot fire a land-based ballistic missile from a host nation's territory without their explicit sovereign authorization.
Right.
You can't just wheel a HIMARS launcher onto the Kuwaiti sand and pull the trigger without the emir's absolute sign-off.
Because doing so implicates the host nation entirely in the act of war.
Exactly.
But I want to push back on that for a second, because we know the U.S. operates with a lot of autonomy on these bases.
True.
So is it entirely impossible that the U.S. just acted unilaterally? Like, did they just launch the missiles and deal with the diplomatic fallout with Kuwait later? Or does this actually prove we are seeing a unified Gulf Cooperation Council front?
The intelligence analysts strongly lean away from unilateral action.
Okay, why?
Because launching a ballistic missile creates a massive physical and electronic signature. Iran's early warning radars track the trajectory directly back to Kuwaiti or Bahraini soil.
So you can't hide it?
No. If Kuwait hadn't authorized it, it would be a catastrophic violation of their sovereignty by the U.S.
Which would fracture the alliance entirely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The fact that the alliance holds tells us the authorization was there.
Right.
Now, Bahrain's involvement is significant, but historically understandable.
Because of their demographics.
Yeah, Bahrain has a minority Sunni monarchy ruling over a Shia majority, and Iran has a long history of supporting Shia militia groups to undermine that monarchy. So Bahrain has always viewed Iran as an existential adversary.
But Kuwait is the massive wild card here.
Absolutely.
Because historically, Kuwait has been the mediator, right? They've maintained a cautious, really pragmatic relationship with Iran.
They try to stay out of the direct line of fire.
Yeah, they host major U.S. headquarters, sure, but diplomatically they take a back seat. They do not want to be the launch pad for a regional war, so why abandon that caution now?
It signals a profound shift in the Gulf's risk calculus.
Meaning what?
Well, the Gulf states rely on the safe passage of the Strait of Hormuz for their economic survival.
Right, the oil has to flow.
So by authorizing these strikes, Kuwait is essentially calculating that the economic devastation of a closed strait is now a greater threat to their national security than the threat of direct Iranian retaliation.
Wow.
They are abandoning plausible deniability. They are sending a unified message to Tehran that they will no longer tolerate proxy actions or maritime blockades without consequence.
And they are willing to anchor themselves firmly to U.S. military operations to enforce that.
Precisely.
But when Kuwait and Bahrain essentially turn their sand into U.S. launch pads, Iran doesn't just issue a diplomatic protest.
No, they respond kinetically.
They mathematically expand the battlefield. The sources map out a massive wave of Iranian missiles launched from Hamadan in western Iran.
Yeah.
And the target selection completely transforms the scope of this conflict.
Iran is heavily reliant on a doctrine of proportionate and sometimes disproportionate escalation. Right. If the Gulf states provide the platform for U.S. strikes, Iran's military doctrine dictates that those platforms must be targeted.
So traditionally, the sources note, Iran has limited its counterstrikes to places like Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan.
The usual suspects.
Right. But in this specific wave, the attack expanded to include the United Arab Emirates and Qatar for the first time in a significant way since May 7th.
Which is a huge escalation.
Huge. Let's look at the specific bases the sources say were targeted. First, there's Muwafaq Salti Air Base, or MSIB, in Jordan.
Yeah.
And the sources note a really specific military detail here. MSIB was hit by medium-range ballistic missiles, or MRBMs, because it sits geographically outside the range of Iran's short-range ballistic missiles.
And this is a crucial technical indicator.
Because of the distance.
Partly, but also because short-range systems are cheaper, they're more plentiful, and they're easier to conceal.
Right.
When Iran chooses to utilize its medium-range ballistic missiles, they are digging deeper into their advanced strategic arsenals.
Oh, I see.
It indicates that MSIB is considered a very high-value target. MSAB is a critical logistical and operational hub for U.S. strike packages across the entire Levant and Gulf regions.
In addition to Jordan, they targeted Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE, and the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, where sources literally reported nonstop explosions and smoke.
Yeah, heavy impacts.
But here is where the fog of war gets incredibly thick, right? The sources report that the UAE successfully intercepted missiles outside its airspace, specifically outside Abu Dhabi.
Which is good news for them.
Yes, however, there were unconfirmed reports of explosions near the U.S. base in Dubai, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, actively claimed they completely destroyed the command and control center and MQ-9 drone hangars at the MSAB base in Jordan.
And this is exactly where the intelligence analyst and the broadcast urges extreme caution.
Why is that?
Because we are dealing with parallel wars here. You have the kinetic war of missiles and the information war of public perception.
Right, because normally within a few hours of a strike, a commercial satellite company like Maxar publishes high-resolution photos of the base.
Exactly.
And we can all see if the hangars are actually gone. So why is that verification suddenly missing here?
It's because of the unique intersection of military security and commercial space technology.
Okay, tell me more.
The U.S. Department of Defense is the primary financial patron for most of these Western commercial satellite companies.
Why? They pay the bills.
Yeah, they hold immense leverage. So the U.S. government possesses the regulatory authority to enact what's called shutter control.
Shutter control.
Basically restricting these commercial companies from releasing imagery of damaged U.S. or allied installations over a specific geographic area during a crisis.
Oh, wow. So the U.S. locks down the imagery to prevent Iran from doing a bomb damage assessment.
Exactly.
Because if Iran doesn't know if they hit the target, they don't know if they need to fire another missile.
That's the exact logic. It denies the enemy crucial targeting data.
Yeah.
But the side effect is this massive information vacuum in the public sphere.
Right.
And when Western imagery is restricted, analysts and the public are forced to rely on non-Western sources or crowdsourced social media.
Which the analysts warn is just an absolute minefield of disinformation.
It is.
We've seen imagery released on social media that has been heavily doctored, utilizing footage from completely different conflicts.
Or employing AI generation to show burning U.S. bases that are actually completely intact.
Exactly. The visual evidence simply cannot be trusted at face value right now.
But even if we assume the absolute worst-case scenario, like, let's say the Iranian MRBMs bypassed air defenses and accurately struck the drone hangars at MSAB.
Okay, let's assume that.
The sources dive into the U.S. military's primary defense against this exact threat. It's a doctrine known as dispersal.
It's the ultimate shell game.
Yeah, it really is.
The sources detail how, because the U.S. maintains that constant overhead surveillance we talked about earlier, they almost always have advanced warning of an incoming ballistic missile wave.
Right, they see the launch probes.
And when they know an attack is imminent, they don't just leave $1 billion worth of fighter jets sitting in a row on the tarmac.
That would be a disaster.
They fly them out, they scatter them.
Dispersal is fundamental to airbase survivability. The sources specifically mention moving assets to locations like Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia.
Which is further away.
Yeah, it acts as a strategic depth catch basin. By scattering the aircraft across multiple distant bases, you ensure that even a direct hit on your primary hangar only destroys concrete, not combat power.
But what about the runways?
Uh,
Because if Iran craters the runway, those dispersed jets can't come back and the base is useless, right?
that is exactly the goal of the attacker. But the intelligence analysis highlights a countermeasure that rarely gets attention, which is rapid runway repair.
I hadn't even thought of that.
Yeah. U.S. Air Force civil engineering squadrons are unparalleled in their ability to fix a destroyed airstrip.
Really? How fast?
Extremely fast. They utilize rapid-setting concrete polymers, prefabricated fiberglass mats, and specialized heavy machinery to literally pave over a massive missile crater and return a runway to operational status in a matter of hours.
Wow, just hours. So if the U.S. can repair a runway in hours and completely negate the physical impact of Iran's strike, Iran has to find a different pressure point.
Yes, they can't just hit the concrete.
They have to hit the alliances. And that brings us to the actual geographic location of these bases and this dual-use dilemma. Because why does hitting Qatar and the UAE matter so much more diplomatically than hitting a runway in an isolated desert?
It comes down to economic vulnerability and the fragile diplomatic balancing act these specific host nations are attempting to maintain.
The sources highlight a crucial reality about places like Al Udeid in Qatar and MSAB in Jordan.
Right.
They are dual-use facilities. These aren't just isolated American fortresses. They are massive, partitioned installations.
There is a U.S. operational side, and there is a sovereign host nation side.
Right. Owned and staffed by Qatari or Jordanian forces. So when an Iranian missile descends on Al Udeid, even if the GPS coordinates are locked onto the American drone hangar, Iran is physically bombing a sovereign Qatari military installation.
The risk of collateral damage, of killing host nation troops, is astronomically high.
Which is terrifying for the host nation.
And the economic implications for these nations are just as terrifying.
Like the UAE.
Yes. The UAE, for instance, has meticulously built an economy entirely reliant on the perception of absolute security and stability.
Right. Tourism and finance.
Exactly. They are a global hub for tourism, international finance, and luxury real estate. Furthermore, they are a primary hub for global shipping insurance.
Oh, the insurance. Right.
If missiles are actively exploding outside Abu Dhabi, maritime insurance premiums for vessels entering the Gulf skyrocket to untenable levels.
The UAE knows this, which is why the sources point out they have actively been trying to improve diplomatic relations with Iran behind the scenes.
They really have.
They've engaged in high-level visits. They've been part of Gulf coalitions donating aircraft to Iran. They are desperate to de-escalate.
Which is exactly what Iran is exploiting.
The paradox of Iran's strategy here is brilliant in a very dark way. It's essentially a mafia protection racket.
That's a good analogy.
Right. Iran is telling the UAE and Qatar, listen, we appreciate the diplomatic visits, we value our trade agreements, but if you let the United States operate strike packages from your backyard, we are going to smash your windows.
Right.
They aren't trying to defeat the U.S. Air Force in Qatar. They are trying to terrify the Qatari government.
It is a highly calculated diplomatic squeeze via kinetic action.
Because the UAE and Qatar are the ones trying to mediate.
Exactly. The UAE and Qatar are actively serving as mediators, trying to negotiate a ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran. So by dropping missiles on their territory, Iran is applying maximum leverage to force these Gulf nations to pivot.
To pressure Washington instead.
Right. They want the UAE and Qatar to go to Washington and say, you have to stop the bombardments. You have to back down because our economies cannot survive this crossfire.
The geopolitical commentator in the sources refers to this as climbing the escalation ladder.
Yes.
You keep stepping up the severity, dragging more economically vulnerable players into the blast radius, and you wait to see who blinks first.
It's a massive game of chicken.
Yeah. If the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, and oil futures start spiraling out of control, and global supply chains begin to seize up, at what point do the Gulf states finally turn to the U.S. and demand they accept Iran's terms?
That is the exact breaking point Iran is testing.
It's testing the whole alliance.
It is a severe test of the U.S. Gulf alliance architecture. How much domestic economic pain are these monarchies willing to absorb to support the American objective of an open maritime corridor?
Which brings us to the target of that pressure, right?
Yeah.
A heavily fractured administration in Washington.
The internal politics.
Yeah, to understand why the U.S. is relying so heavily on these rapid, massive military strikes instead of diplomacy, we have to look at the internal political civil war detailed in the intelligence reports.
It's a mess.
The sources are incredibly blunt. The ceasefire, this memorandum of understanding, exists on paper only. It is completely dead in practice.
And the breakdown of that MOU is driven by a fundamental philosophical division within the U.S. executive branch regarding how to handle Iran globally.
The sources map out two distinct camps. On one side, you have figures like Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who are characterized as being vehemently opposed to further negotiations.
They represent the camp favoring maximum kinetic pressure.
Right. On the other side, the sources note that figures like Vice President J.D. Vance, who was explicitly tasked by Trump to lead the negotiations, along with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, are the ones desperately trying to build a diplomatic off-ramp.
So you have the military apparatus and the diplomatic apparatus operating from two completely different paradigms of risk.
So break down the actual argument here for us. Why does Hegseth's camp believe diplomacy is a dead end, while Vance's camp believes it's the only solution? What is the philosophical difference?
Well, the kinetic pressure camp, represented by Hegseth and Rubio, views the Iranian regime as an inherently bad faith actor.
Okay, so they don't trust them at all.
Not at all. From their perspective, any MOU or ceasefire is simply a tactical delay utilized by Tehran to rebuild their missile stockpiles, reposition their proxy forces, and recover economically.
They see it as a stall tactic.
Exactly. They believe that allowing Iran to dictate the terms of the Strait of Hormuz fundamentally undermines global U.S. hegemony.
Right.
Therefore, the only viable strategy is to use overwhelming military force to physically dismantle Iran's capability to project power. You don't negotiate with the threat, you destroy it.
But the diplomatic wing sees a different existential threat.
Exactly. The camp led by Vance, Kushner, and Witkoff is looking at the economic dashboard.
Right, the markets.
They understand that a prolonged, high-intensity conflict in the Gulf will inevitably lead to a global energy crisis.
Which affects everyone.
If oil spikes to $150 a barrel and maritime shipping halts, the domestic U.S. economy suffers massive inflation.
Which is political suicide.
Exactly. They view the economic fallout of the war as a far greater threat to American stability than whatever temporary regional advantage Iran might gain from a ceasefire.
So they want a deal.
They are pushing for a deal because they believe the American public has no appetite for the economic cost of a new Middle Eastern war.
And at the very center of this tug of war is former President Trump's absolute red line. The Strait of Hormuz must be unconditionally open and safe for all shipping, exactly as it was before the conflict began.
Right, that's the hard line.
But the sources point out that Iran's position is completely irreconcilable with that demand. Iran insists that the MOU grants them management authority over the strait. They want to dictate that ships must go through their designated northern routes, submitting to Iranian oversight, while the U.S. demands free navigation through the Omani side.
It is a fundamental clash over sovereignty and international maritime law.
You can't really compromise on that.
No, you cannot compromise when one side demands absolute freedom of navigation and the other demands absolute sovereign control over the exact same stretch of water.
So how does a nation project a cohesive strategy when the left hand is trying to draft a peace treaty and the right hand is dropping Tomahawk missiles?
It's incredibly disjointed.
Because the sources mention a specific turning point where the trust completely evaporated. The pause for the funeral of Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei.
That pause was the death knell for traditional diplomacy.
Really? Why that specific moment?
Both sides agreed to a temporary halt in hostilities to accommodate the funeral proceedings.
Okay, a standard diplomatic pause.
But during that exact window of supposed peace, the IRGC launched strikes against maritime vessels.
They used the funeral as cover to attack.
Precisely. And for the kinetic camp in Washington, that shattered any remaining illusion that Iran could be trusted to honor an agreement.
So the diplomatic wing lost all their leverage.
Exactly. So now the administration is unified around a hybrid strategy. Coercion.
Coercion through military force.
Yes. They are no longer using military force just to destroy a specific radar site or a weapons depot. They're utilizing military action as the primary diplomatic tool.
Wow.
The goal is to inflict such a high level of cumulative, unbearable pain on the Iranian infrastructure that their negotiating position entirely collapses. It is diplomacy executed via high explosives.
But if Washington is fractured over how to end the war, the intelligence sources reveal that Tehran is fractured over whether they even want the war to end at all.
The internal dynamics in Tehran right now are arguably the most dangerous, unpredictable variable in this entire crisis.
Because of the power vacuum.
Yes, we're looking at a post-Khamenei power vacuum.
And when you remove a supreme autocratic leader who has centralized authority for decades, the resulting vacuum almost always triggers a vicious internal struggle for survival.
Historically, yes, every single time.
Following the death of Ali Khamenei, the reports are clear. There is no single ultimate decision-maker in Iran holding the reins.
The system has fragmented.
Right. Mojtaba Khamenei is attempting to consolidate power and take his father's place, but he is facing massive institutional resistance. And you have entirely different factions fighting for control over the future of the state.
It's a multi-front political war.
For instance, the sources state that Iranian President Pezeshkian was the one heavily pressuring for the MOU to be signed in the first place.
Which makes sense because Pezeshkian represents the pragmatic, technocratic wing of the government.
He's looking at the numbers.
He is looking at the internal economic metrics of Iran, which are frankly catastrophic.
Right.
Years of sanctions, coupled with the cost of funding proxy networks, have completely gutted the Iranian middle class.
So he needs relief.
Yes. Pezeshkian recognizes that if this massive U.S. bombardment continues and the state remains entirely isolated, the economy will suffer a total unrecoverable collapse.
Mm.
He pushed for the MOU out of pure state survival necessity.
But on a complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have the hardliners within the IRGC.
Military wing.
And the sources suggest these hardliners are actively, deliberately undermining Pezeshkian's diplomatic efforts.
Yes.
Which brings up a really fascinating theory discussed in the intelligence broadcast, the rogue elements theory.
This is a really important point to clarify.
When those commercial tankers were struck during Khamenei's funeral, Arab mediators reportedly believed it wasn't a coordinated order from the Supreme National Security Council. They believed it was unauthorized rogue IRGC commanders striking the ships specifically to sabotage the MOU.
Because they didn't want a peace deal to succeed.
Exactly.
But the analyst in the source material provides a brilliant counterweight to this theory by explaining Iran's actual military doctrine, known as the Mosaic Defense.
Okay, what exactly is the Mosaic Defense?
It is a highly decentralized command and control structure.
Decentralized?
Yes. The IRGC knows that in a full-scale war with the U.S., their central communications networks in Tehran will be destroyed in the first hour.
Right. The U.S. will wipe out their comms.
Exactly. So to survive, the Mosaic Defense gives local regional commanders a massive degree of tactical autonomy.
Oh, I see.
It allows them to fight on, launch missiles, and execute ambushes, even if they are entirely cut off from central command.
So it looks like rogue action, but it's actually by design.
Exactly. However, and this is key, the expert cautions that while a local commander has tactical leeway, launching a strategic ballistic missile strike against an international tanker during a highly sensitive funeral ceasefire.
That's a bit much for a local commander.
Yeah, that strains the bounds of the Mosaic Doctrine. That isn't tactical defense, that is a strategic offensive action meant to tank international negotiations.
Which implies it wasn't a rogue mistake.
No, it was a deliberate strategy by a specific faction within the IRGC.
But why? I mean, why would the IRGC want to sabotage a peace deal that would lift sanctions and stop American bombs from falling on their country?
Because the paradox of Iran's strategy is that the IRGC actually benefits from the sanctions and the conflict.
Explain the mechanics of that, because on the surface, it sounds totally counterintuitive.
I know, but think about it. When a country is placed under crushing international sanctions, legitimate, transparent trade dies.
Right. The normal economy shuts down.
But the demand for goods doesn't disappear. So who controls the black market?
Oh.
Who controls the smuggling routes, the illicit oil transfers, and the shadow banking networks?
The IRGC.
Exactly. The sanctions have allowed the IRGC to monopolize massive sectors of the Iranian economy.
Wow.
If a peace deal is signed and legitimate multinational corporations return to Iran, the IRGC loses its economic monopoly. Peace weakens them financially.
And it weakens them politically, too. The sources detail how the IRGC utilizes extreme domestic repression mass executions, hanging protesters, seizing private property, and violent internal purges to maintain absolute control over the population.
Yes.
Any hope for a democratic uprising after the recent mass protests has been completely shattered by this war.
A continued state of war is the ultimate gift to an authoritarian hardliner.
Because it justifies everything.
It allows them to declare martial law, label any domestic political opponent as a traitor aligned with the Americans, and eliminate all calls for democratic reform under the impenetrable guise of national security.
So the external war against the U.S. is the exact mechanism they use to guarantee their domestic survival against their own citizens.
That is exactly right.
And the terrifying reality is that they possess the specific tools to sustain this asymmetric war indefinitely.
The drones.
Yeah, the intelligence sources list an incredibly detailed Iranian drone and missile arsenal that makes this possible. We're talking about the Shahed 136, the Shahed 129, the Shahed 131, the Qazo 4, the IO-2T.
And these aren't just names, you know. They represent an asymmetric economic advantage.
Right, the cost difference.
Yes, a Shahed loitering munition can be manufactured for roughly $20,000 to $50,000 using commercially available parts.
Which is nothing in military terms.
It's pennies. But to shoot it down, the U.S. or its Gulf allies often have to fire an advanced surface-to-air interceptor that costs $2 to $4 million per shot.
It's an unsustainable math equation. You can't win a war where it costs you $2 million to destroy a $20,000 remote-controlled airplane.
And because these drones are cheap, easily assembled in decentralized underground workshops, it is virtually impossible for the U.S. to knock out every single manufacturing facility.
There are just too many of them.
The IRGC can replenish their arsenal faster than the U.S. can safely intercept them.
Which leads us directly into the ultimate looming question that the analysts in the broadcast wrestle with. Having dissected the tactical realities on the ground, the economic vulnerabilities of the Gulf, and the deeply fractured political systems in both Washington and Tehran, where does this actually go?
That's the big question.
Are we looking at a temporary violent spike in escalation that will force a climax? Or are we looking at a horrifying new normal?
The intelligence analysts lean heavily toward the latter.
The new normal.
Yeah, the sources literally quote observers stating that this level of violence is becoming very normal. The idea that both sides are now perfectly comfortable exchanging heavy strategic military blows on a regular basis without ever formally declaring war.
A permanent high-intensity friction, and the threats of escalation are massive.
They are.
The sources actively question whether the U.S. will be forced to reimpose a complete physical naval blockade on Iranian ports. They question whether Israel, seeing the degradation of U.S. deterrence, will be invited to join the Strait campaigns directly against Iranian nuclear or military targets.
Because the long-term stakes here are existential. As the expert source points out, this conflict has transcended the immediate issue of which commercial ships get to sail through the Strait of Hormuz today.
Right.
It is fundamentally a war over what the nation of Iran looks like 1, 5, or 10 years from now.
Because the IRGC hardliners are fighting tooth and nail to ensure it remains a heavily militarized, isolated, authoritarian state where they hold absolute uncontested power.
And they absolutely require this external conflict with the West to justify that internal iron grip.
Yeah.
On the opposing side, the U.S. administration is making a massive geopolitical gamble. They are betting that applying extreme, relentless military and economic pressure will eventually crack the Iranian regime from the inside out.
Which is a huge bet.
They believe they can force a systemic concession before the global economy breaks under the compounding strain of closed shipping lanes and spiking oil futures.
But right now, both sides are just doubling and tripling down.
No one is backing off.
The sources do suggest, highly speculatively, that Trump might eventually be the one forced to blink.
Right, because of economic pressure.
Yeah, the logic is that the immense compounding pressure from Gulf allies, whose economies are actively threatened by the crossfire, combined with the very real threat of a global market crash, might force Washington to accept a flawed deal just to stop the bleeding.
But the overriding sentiment across all the intelligence reporting is that the situation remains highly unpredictable.
Extremely.
When you have a leaderless, fractured power structure in Tehran operating on institutional paranoia, and a deeply divided administration in Washington operating on conflicting paradigms of risk, unpredictability is the only absolute certainty.
Let's pull all of this together and recap the incredible cascading sequence of events we've mapped out today.
It's a lot.
It started with a demand for an open street, which was met 24 hours later by an Iranian ballistic missile striking a civilian hull. That triggered an almost incomprehensible 20-minute pre-authorized U.S. retaliation, utilizing unbroken satellite-to-jet intelligence links.
Right.
We saw the unprecedented involvement of historically cautious Gulf states like Kuwait, allowing land-based ATACMS missile launches from their sovereign soil.
A massive shift.
We watched Iran mathematically expand its target chessboard in response, hitting dual-use bases in the UAE and Qatar to execute a calculated diplomatic squeeze on Washington.
Heating the escalation ladder.
And beneath every single missile launch, we uncovered the internal political chaos, the fractured camps in Washington arguing over coercion versus diplomacy, and the hardliners in Tehran who actively require the war to maintain their domestic authoritarian survival.
Because we are witnessing a profound real-time reshaping of the entire Middle Eastern security architecture. The old rules no longer apply.
And we want to remind you, the listener, why every single detail of this matters to you. This is not some distant geopolitical theory playing out in a vacuum or an academic textbook. This is a conflict that is actively, aggressively shaping the global economy.
It affects everyday life.
It is dictating maritime shipping insurance rates, which dictates the cost of the goods on your shelves.
Yep.
It is directly impacting the price of energy you pay to heat your home and drive your car.
Yeah.
And on a deeper level, it is redefining the very concept of international diplomacy in the modern era. When ballistic missiles officially replace diplomatic memos, the whole world feels the shockwave.
Which leaves us with a final, deeply critical question for you to mull over.
Lay it on us.
We spent the last hour exploring how modern military technology, specifically inexpensive, easily replenished drone and missile arsenals, allows a nation to sustain an asymmetric conflict almost indefinitely.
Right. The Shahids.
They are largely immune to traditional economic sanctions because the regime itself thrives on the black market those sanctions create. So if precision weapons have made the physical cost of waging a localized, permanent war cheaper than the political cost of making compromises at a negotiating table,
Wow.
are we entering an era where the very concept of a ceasefire is obsolete?
Wow.
Is permanent, low-boil warfare simply the new foundation of international relations?
That is a chilling, sobering thought to end on, but it's exactly why we do this show. We have to look at the mechanics of the reality in front of us, not the reality we wish we had. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking beyond the headlines, and we will catch you next time as we continue to try and make sense of these incredibly muddy waters.